everyone. Thank you for taking time out to join us today at this webinar, Petroleum Industry Act. Utica Discuss is our platform for sensitizing the public on topical issues. And today we'll be discussing the Petroleum Industry Act. As we all know, the Nigerian economy is largely dependent on the petroleum industry. Hence, any policy in this industry should interest all of us because it affects all of us. Mr. Oluwatomininu Familusi, a senior manager at Ernst & Young, has been kind enough to discuss salient issues regarding the PIA with us. Some of us would still call it PIB, Petroleum Industry Bill, because that was in our head for so long. But thankfully, it's now moved from being a bill to becoming an act. My colleague Ronke Osho, who is the head of portfolio management here at Utica Capital Limited, would moderate the discussion, and I'm sure she will start with a quick run-through of the profile of our guest discussant. I hope we all learned something new from this or get answers to any questions that may be lingering in our mind before now. So please listen, enjoy, learn, and feel free to use the chat room to post whatever questions you may have for the discussant or us at Utica. And all of those will try to deal with them within time at the end of the presentation by Mr. Familusi. So Ronke, over to you. I hope you can, Ronke, over to you. I hope you heard all that.
Yes, we did. Yes, I heard you.
Okay.
Yeah. Good morning, and thank you very much, sir, and welcome everyone to this session of the Utica Discuss. Just like Mr. Beldoy has said, this is to shed light on some contemporary issues in the country. So I'll go straight to the profile of our panelists this morning in person of Mr. Oluwatomininu Familusi. Mr. Familusi is a senior manager in the tax service line focused on taxation of energy companies at Ernst & Young, Nigeria. He's a tax consultant with over 11 years experience and experienced tax advisor with significant experience in the provision of tax advisory and consulting services to both local and international companies in Nigeria, with his core in the oil and gas sector. So he has provided tax compliance services spanning corporate income tax, withholding tax, VAT, also known as the value-added tax, pay-as-you-earn taxes, and other statutory deductions for companies in the upstream, midstream, and downstream sector of oil and gas, power, utilities, and consumer businesses. Mr. Familusi was the project team lead that assessed the current tax state and documented its diagnostic review report of the largest indigenous oil and gas exploration company in Nigeria. He also assisted in advising the company on the most efficient, on the most tax efficient corporate structure for the reorganization of its subsidiaries into a holdco. He also provided several advisory on the tax and regulatory implications of setting up new businesses in Nigeria, detailed strategies for new entrants, and of course the implications of joint venture. He has facilitated various in-house training programs for Ernst & Young, for clients, including the delivery of a tax education workshop for leading multinational companies within the oil and gas sector. He has anchored he anchored a presentation to the board of directors of a major indigenous oil company in Nigeria on the optimal structure that aligns the requirements of the Nigerian Oil and Gas Industry Content Development Act of 2010. He was a member of the team that facilitated a co-workshop between NCDMB and relevant stakeholders where policies contained in the Nigerian Oil and Gas Local Content Act and supporting regulations were discussed and amendments were put forward. He's a member of the tax knowledge management team in EY, Ernst & Young, where he's involved in different thought leadership materials with specific emphasis on the analysis of tax cases decided at the Tax Appeal Tribunal and other judicial courts, including the Court of Appeal and Supreme Court. He is a graduate of the University of Lagos, first class honors cell biology and genetics. He's a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria, and he's also an affiliate member of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants. Mr. Famlusi, welcome to our webinar, and thank you for honoring us. So on this note, we would like to start off with the topic of today. So, Mr. Famlusi, will you be kind enough to share your slides, and let's set this in motion? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's also an honor to be here. I'll just take a moment to share my slides, and once my slides are up, just let me know that you can actually see my slides.
Yes, we can see your slides. You can just have, okay. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, the much talked about Petroleum Industry Act, like we are already aware, it's the new act on the block of various acts within the oil and gas industry. It's expected to make certain changes within the oil and gas industry as we speak. So it's much talked about, right? A whole lot of stakeholders, right, involved within the oil and gas industry are apparently still looking and analyzing the act as we speak. But before we delve into certain nitty-gritties in the act, I would just like to run through some key understanding of the Nigerian oil and gas landscape. Right. So one thing we should understand is the oil and gas landscape, right, as we speak, is on the precipice of a paradigm shift. Right. It has never been, right, in the oil and gas industry as we speak, for us to have significant changes like what we are recording within the oil and gas industry in this year. Right. Only in this year, we started off with the marginal field bid rounds, which was concluded sometime around May and June, where award letters were handed over to applicants and candidates who were scaled through the process, had the qualified requirements in accordance with the regulations from the Department of Petroleum Resources. That alone, we also have had major international oil companies excessively divesting some of the asset portfolios, specifically asset portfolios within the onshore and the shallow water terrains. Then the final one is the introduction of the Petroleum Industry Act, which a lot of people or a lot of stakeholders are saying it couldn't have come at the best time. As we speak, the Nigerian oil and gas industry accounts for at least 90% of our foreign exchange. It contributes at least 7% to our GDP, and it's responsible for about 70 to 80% of our export earnings. So it has a significant hold on the Nigerian economy over the years, although we've seen decline, right, within the industry over the years. For instance, we've had GDPs as high as 13% as far back as 2013, which has significantly nosedived to 7%. We've had investment decline within the sector, right? For instance, within 2015 to 2019, we lost our pole position as the investment destination for the oil and gas industry in Africa. We are the largest producers of oil and gas, right, within Africa. And still at that, we were not able to keep our pole position during those periods, given the uncertainty in policy stimulation, especially policies impacting the industry. For instance, within that period, reports have it that we had the investment in Africa was as high as $90 billion, and Nigeria was only able to get 4% of that investment. So, which means a lot isn't happening in that industry with respect to investment, and all significantly attributable to uncertainties in the policy and certain host-community issues, which we will be talking through, and a couple of other infrastructure challenges. Now, the industry is bifurcated into the upstream, midstream, and downstream. We have several players operating within these streams, and we have also regulators who are responsible for the directing affairs within these streams. Up until now, we have the Department of Petroleum Resources, who has the key function of regulating some of the activities within all of these streams with, how do I put it, with its significant role cutting across all of these streams, right? So now, if you also look at certain production forecasts that we have, you could see that over the years, we've also been reporting a bit of a decline, right? With things as high as 2014 going down, and hopefully with the enactment of the Act, looking at a possible increase in some of this production with respect to oil and also with respect to gas. So again, if we look at the landscape, we would see that the crude oil production cuts across basically 3 terrains, right? We would have the onshore, shallow water, and shallow offshore terrains, which have been the predominant terrains over the time, right, for production because of the ease and access to infrastructure from land. We've gradually seen a movement, right, into the deep offshore and frontier basins terrain, which is far away from land territories over a period that has continued to improve. I mean, I had mentioned earlier that if you look at what is happening currently, a lot of the IOCs who predominantly play within this space are already divesting their assets and looking at production within the deep offshore. Then looking at contractual arrangements also, contractual arrangements within the space has always been in majorly 4 buckets, right? We have the joint venture operations, which was predominantly what was used for petroleum operations, where the NNPC would go into a joint venture with any of the participants or operators or license holders, as the case may be, for production within those fields. Over time, the JV has reported issues with respect to cash call from the NNPC, and this has predominantly moved that contractual agreement to the production sharing contract, where the NNPC as the concessionaire contracts entities to explore and produce oil and gas within a particular field. Then we have the sole risk, and which is a bit not far from the PSC, right? Some form of modified PSC that requires you to put in all your costs, and expected revenue will then be shared with the government. And then we have the marginal field operators, just like I mentioned, with the new marginal field licensing round that has just been concluded. That has also been the predominant contractual arrangement within the sector. Now, all of these uncertainties and issues within the industry, and especially with respect to all of these fiscal frameworks that we've mentioned, has been the bane for a reduction in investment for the country. And significantly, like I mentioned, this has been attributed to policy uncertainty, and most of which has been pointed to the delay in the enactment of the Petroleum Industry Act, which over time has been called the Petroleum Industry Bill for over 15 years, right? So given the misalignment of interests, stakeholders not agreeing, and a couple of powers of the ministers being contemplated to have been reduced, also host community issues, those have been the major issues preventing the passage of the bill into an act. But that has moved and that has changed. We now have the Petroleum Industry Act, which essentially is an aggregation of different acts within the petroleum industry. I would say at least between 11 and 15, repealing all of those existing oil and gas laws and putting them just in one act, right? And what the Petroleum Industry Act seeks to do essentially would say into two buckets. One is to improve the transparency and efficiency within that industry by aligning the interest of regulators, ensuring that whatever regulatory bodies we have within that sector, right, are carved out in such a way that whatever it is that we're doing ensures transparency, and in the ultimate bit also attract investment and improve the ease of doing business within that industry, which you can also dovetail to the second bucket, which is looking at the fiscal framework, looking at the host community framework, and seeing how that can best suit activities within the petroleum industry. That's essentially what the Act seeks as an objective. Also not forgetting the fact that it also seeks to improve government revenue, but again, while doing that, ensure that investors get their money's worth into whatever it is that they put into the sector. So, I mean, a bit of history, I've already mentioned over 15 years, we've had a delay, and sometime 1st of July 2021, we had an historic moment where the House of Reps and the Senate agreed on the provisions of the Act, and that was passed. It was sent forth to the President for sign-off, and on August 16, 2021, the President signed it into law. So the bill then turned into the Petroleum Industry Act 2021, right? So, and maybe people would have asked the question, what exactly do we need the PIF? I mean, I've mentioned a couple as to say, look, there hasn't been investment within that space in a long time, right? It's significantly dwindled. We lost our pole position to countries within Africa like Ghana, Senegal, Mozambique, right? And here we are being the largest producers within the African region. We account for 1/3 of production within Africa. So it speaks a lot that we aren't doing enough, essentially because we do not have the right policies to attract investment into the oil and gas sector. Also to restructure the industry, very critical, right? Because the industry has been, there has been issue around transparency, regulators not doing what they're supposed to do, and just having impact and effect even on international oil companies who are currently operating. So a lot of that the PIA seeks to change. And then, I mean, one and the most important would be looking at revamping most of our outdated laws, right? Most of our laws, if you look at the Petroleum Act, has been enacted as far back as 1969. So it's not reflective of the current climate, right? Where businesses have changed, operations have changed, and people need to start thinking about things differently. And so that's part of the key objectives that the Act seeks to drive at. Now, the Act is split into 4 major sections, also not forgetting that there's a miscellaneous section within the Act, but key to our discussion here is it's split into 4 major categories. We have the governance and the institution part of the bill, which essentially talks about the commercial framework for regulators within within the oil and gas industry, how to promote effectiveness and efficiency within that industry is what is key as the first chapter in that Act. The second chapter actually talks about the administration, essentially looking at what the governance and institution framework is, right? And then seeing how you can strengthen it from being accountable and also having certain guidelines to license holders, be it within the upstream, midstream, or downstream sector of the economy, of how you can proceed with licensing requirements, tariffs, fees, rents, and all of that that needs to be paid. So that's essentially what the administrative part of the Act is focused on. Then we have the third chapter, which talks about host community. It's no longer news that we've had issues with the host community over a period where there's not been sustainable development and prosperity between the host communities, right, and the license holder. So that chapter 6 to change that view and see how we can come in and make it a lot more prosperous for both parties. Then we finally have the fiscal framework, which is one of the biggest changes, right? It completely revamps the Petroleum Profit Tax Act and the Deep Offshore Act, which changes to specific fiscal framework within the Act. So as we go on and along, I'll take you through some key changes within some of these sections. First, to start with, is the governance and institution. We have 4 key parts here where we talk about the powers of the minister. Interestingly, one of the changes here is a reduction in the powers of the minister with respect to granting and revoking licenses. Before now, that has been the bane and the core work for the Minister of Petroleum. So what is to happen with the PIA as we speak is that the commission, and I will talk to the commission in a while, and the authority would actually recommend, right, after they've approved it for a license, to send those recommendations to the Minister of Petroleum just to sign up. So a bit of reduction in powers there for the minister. Then I move into the Regulatory Commission, which is essentially set up to focus on the upstream bit of the value chain. So it's going to have the technical and commercial operations being handled by it. So things around the licensing will be handled, things around technical issues with respect to production and exploration, right, for upstream companies would also be regulated and handled by the Commission. Just in that same light is the midstream and the downstream authority. So whilst the Commission is focused on the upstream bit, the midstream and downstream authority will be focused mainly on the midstream and the downstream value chain. So essentially the same thing, technical, commercial regulations within that space, also in the issuance of licenses and petroleum operations will also be handled by the authority. Then finally is the setup of the NNPC Limited. So there will be a change, right, from the current NNPC that we have, and it would be, that will be closed, and we will now have a new NNPC Limited. So a company which is going to be commercially set up, right, and it will have no recourse to government funds. So it will determine its own, how it intends to make its own money, and technically, commercially, and in whatever aspects that it needs to step it up to make that much money, it will be the responsibility of the NNPC Limited. And the Act requires that the NNPC Limited needs to be set up within 6 months from the commencement of the Act. One key thing is that the NNPC Limited, the shares of the NNPC Limited will be held by the Ministry of Finance Incorporated and the Ministry of Petroleum Resources Incorporated. And it will be held in by 50% each will be the shares held in NNPC Limited. And those shares will not be transferable until approved by the government. So that's just some key changes from the governance and institution bill. I think quickly move to the administration. I've mentioned that the administration essentially focuses on how the regulators would look at some of the licensing arrangements, also some of the commercial and technical requirements, put them into laws, and then see how those would then be administered, right? So, I mean, for instance, under the model contract, which I've mentioned when I talked about the oil and gas landscape, we are going to see a move from the joint venture structure to an incorporated joint venture. So with the setup of the NNPC Limited, what you would have is the NNPC Limited going into an incorporated joint venture with participants within the space. So those, so it means, for instance, NNPC Limited comes to meet, I'm just giving an example, comes to meet Shell for development of an area. So the development of that area will be, the interest for development of that area will be held by a company that will be set up by both of them based on an agreed equity share and percentage. But note that the Act still requires that NNPC has at least 60% participatory right in any of those contractual arrangements. Then we move to licenses and leases as prescribed by the Act. There's going to be a change from what we currently have, where we currently have the OEL, OPL, OML. That's the oil exploration licensing, oil prospecting licenses, and oil mining lease. All those will be converted into the petroleum exploration license, petroleum prospecting license, and petroleum mining lease. So a bit of not so much of a change, right, with respect to the expiry date for holding some of these licenses, but changes just here and there with respect to nomenclature and how the commission and the authority, the commission will be administering those licenses going forward, especially when we speak through conversion contracts. I'll get there shortly. So then we move to mergers, transfers, and acquisition, right? So the Act requires that you cannot assign, you cannot transfer or novate any of your license or lease without the written consent of the minister. So you would go through the commission and ensure you have the written consent of the minister. So that isn't much of a significant change when compared with what the Petroleum Act says. But the PIA goes further to state that if at the level of the parent company holding the license, so for instance, ABC Limited is incorporated in Nigeria for carrying out petroleum operations. However, ABC Limited is maybe held 100% by ABC Offshore, right? If there's a change in the equity structure at the offshore level, then there has to be a notification also in that regard. So just extending it by one more layer, that's what the PI seeks to do. So things around royalties, rents, and other payments, it prescribes that those will be paid to the government. It's not so different in any case from the PPT, from the Petroleum Act, right? But it just also prescribes that there could be penalties if some of these things are not paid over to the government. Then I think one of the key interests would be on the voluntary conversion as speculated by Section 92, right, where holders of mining leases have the voluntary conversion requirement within 18 months from the commencement of the Act. So between now and February 2023, holders of oil mining leases, holders of licenses can look at the portfolio of assets and determine whether they want to convert to the PIA terms if it is favorable to them, or they would have to wait for the expiration of their license. So essentially, if you do not convert within 18 months, you go on with your current either PPTA terms, right, or deep offshore terms, such that at the expiration of your license, once they will be issuing you a new license, it will be under the Petroleum Industry Act terms. So looking at the midstream and downstream angle, you would notice that the Act kind of has a bias for gas development, which is actually very critical, right? The world is already moving away from oil and gas. Even though gas is still a bit favorable because of its lower carbon footprint. So a lot of the provisions within the Act tries to see how we can harness our reserves within the gas space. I mean, we are the country with the largest gas reserve in Africa, proven gas reserves in Africa, about 260 trillion cubic feet, which is a lot, and it is untapped. We are the 9th largest in the world. So there are certain provisions directed at seeing how we can harness those reserves and see how we can also push them into domestic gas development. So things around domestic gas obligations, requiring producers to ensure that strategic sectors, especially the power sector, get some level of gas on as prescribed by the regulations that will be set up in that area, also embedded within the Act. Gas flaring penalties being introduced, which would no longer be tax deductible, right? Or neither can you cost recover them if you're paying for those gas flaring penalties. And they are now massively huge, right? As high as $2, right? So And also things around pricing, regulating pricing to prevent anti-competitive behavior within that space, and also encourage private participation within that space. And then finally, setting up a midstream gas infrastructure fund, which is supposed to be focused on developing the gas infrastructure within that space, right? And a levy of about 0.5 on wholesale price of petroleum products. So it will be used to develop that midstream gas infrastructure fund and ensure that on an aggregate basis, we have an improvement in the gas master plan as we have them, and also improvement in the domestic gas market in country. Then also, very important, like I mentioned, as the host community issue, over a period, it's been a thorn in the flesh of certain operators where you have facilities being destroyed as a result of incessant or favorable relationship between both parties. So the Act introduces the host community development trust fund, which is supposed to be set up by settlers or operators within the industry. The host community development trust is going to be made up of a board of trustees and a management committee. Board of trustees will be made up of people from the host communities who have high integrity and professional standing as the Act contemplates. So some of these things are just geared towards ensuring that there is an improved relationship between both parties, such that the increased costs resulting from facilities being destroyed, right, would be substantially reduced. So a whole lot of participation from the host communities would be embedded within this particular section, right? So then the trust is expected to be set up. The trust is expected to be set up on or before 12 months from the effective date of the Act, right? And the time frame for the host community development trust fund, that's basically the time frame. Then the funds that are contributed there, right, would have to be allocated in a specific portion as determined by the Act. 75% would go into capital production, 20% would be retained in a reserve fund, and 5% for the day-to-day operation of the trust. Now, the settlers also, which are the oil and gas companies, will need to carry out a needs assessment, right? Looking at what the community needs at a particular point in time, and then bring that into what needs to be done. Now, the host community fund is going to be funded by 3% of the preceding year annual operating expenditure of the settlers. So that will be the critical way for funding that the development, the trust fund. And also donations are also allowed, and all those things coming into one bracket is what the host committees would be expecting to enjoy from the setup of the development trust fund. Then quickly move to setting conversion into place from the fiscal perspective. One critical thing that we need to understand is the Act contemplates a conversion, voluntary conversion, but there are things that needs to be understood before the voluntary conversion can happen, right? The very first one is there is a requirement to relinquish at least 60% of your contract area. So if you're operating within a particular field and contract area, you are required to put that contract area into 5 different buckets, which would essentially be areas where you think you have significant oil and gas discovery, areas where you think merits an appraisal and you've submitted an appraisal program to the commission, areas where you think that you're already developing, like with respect to there's already commercial production in such areas. Areas also where you think that you might get commercially significant discovery, but you haven't started, but you have a field development plan already in place to see how you want to develop that area. So all of this put into 5 buckets is not expected to take up more than 40% of that contract area. The balance 60% will be relinquished, should be relinquished. However, the Act also contemplates that if there's a possibility that if you put this contract area into those 5 buckets and they extend a bit beyond 40%, then there might be consideration for you to take up whatever is above the 40%. Then key also in converting is to understand that whatever arbitration you have with the regulatory authorities, you would need to terminate that immediately you convert. So if there are benefits that you are thinking you would get or you are hoping to get from that area, you have to drop that from because you understand that there are a whole lot of dispute resolutions within that sector. So if this is going to happen, you have to consider dropping that and then move that over to, and then whatever cash flow you're expected to get from that would then probably be lost. Then just to touch on some key fiscal changes, I'll start with the introduction of the hydrocarbon tax, which is going to be at the rate of 15% or 30% for onshore and shallow waters, right? So for instance, as we speak, if you look at the schematic I have here, right, the current rate, tax rate, the PPT rate for petroleum operations within the onshore and shallow water for the first 5 years, it's at 65.75%. And then anything thereafter that is at 85%. So imagine a significant reduction as low as 15% or 30%, depending on whether you have a petroleum prospecting license or a petroleum mining lease. So a significant reduction and a positive fiscal terms for people who are looking and intending to convert. Also for marginal fields who also fall within the onshore and shallow water, the rate is now going to be at 15%. So, I mean, everyone would want to convert looking at some of these very favorable terms, right? So, but you also need to understand that the company's income tax rate will now cut across every single value chain of the petroleum industry. So including the upstream, then they will also need to pay company's income tax at the rate of 30%. So essentially, we are looking at a headline rate of about 60%, right? So that's 30% HT, 30% company's income tax, which in effect, if you still look at it compared with 85%, it's still a lot beneficial, right? Across. Then we come to royalties, where we also have a significant reduction, looking at onshore shallow water from as high as 20% or 18.5%. We have royalties as low for onshore and shallow water for 15% based on production, and as low as 12.5% in shallow water, also based on production. Then it bifurcates to say that if you have production of just about 5,000 barrels per day in any month, you would have a royalty rate as low as 5%, and anything beyond that maybe at 7.5%. So, I mean, very good favorable terms. Deep offshore is at.
Hello? We lost you at a point. It was breaking, but it seems to be fine now. You can continue.
Okay, sincere apologies. So, so I was saying the royalty rate as we speak is significantly also reduced, even if you look across all the terrains. Now, but there's a catch. There is an introduction of royalty rates per price. So it's going to be introduced, right, for all terrains. The first introduction of this was within the Deep Offshore Act, which was amended in 2019, which was supposed to only impact terrains as deep offshore and frontier basin, but that has been changed with the PIS. It's going to cover across all the terrains, and it's going to be at $100 per barrel. It's going to be as high as 5%, and anything above $150 is going to be at 10%. But one thing you should notice, it's going to be by a linear extrapolation. So once you have your oil price pegged at $50 and above, at least you would have a particular royalty rate as low as 2.5% based on pricing to pay in that region. So, I mean, operators and license holders will need to consider this as part of their conversion requirements under this change. Then just to touch on a bit of some of the key things you should note from the fiscal terms, the key are those I've just mentioned, but understand that there are a whole lot of changes also, but just to touch on some of the key changes, for instance, the cost price limit, which has just been introduced, right? which pegs your cost for tax deductibility at 65% of gross revenue, right? So whatever it is that you cannot claim in a particular year, you can actually carry forward. Then we have things around production allowances, which have just been introduced, which is going to be based on your production level. So before now, it used to be based on your addition, your capex addition, which is in form of your petroleum investment allowance, your investment tax allowance, or investment tax credit. So that would be completely expunged and replaced with the production allowance. Then things around transfer pricing being introduced as a measure for ascertaining transactions between related parties, right? And then also separating entities involved in upstream, midstream, and downstream are expected to, so that's integrated oil and gas companies, are expected to separate these operations and then set up new companies for these operations. Yeah, so I mean, that's just a bit of what we would have from the fiscal. Question would be, what would be the opportunities available, right, for parties intending to go into the act, right, as we speak? So I'll first start off with a bit of conversation we've been having is looking at investment portfolio within the sector. It's significantly going to help to improve investment within, attract foreign direct investment in the sector, and ultimately hopefully boost the country's economy with respect to an increase in that investment. So, I mean, that's what the PIA contemplates, and looking at the outlook is what parties are also contemplating, that given the favorable fiscal terms that we have, if you look at it holistically, right, it's an incentive for companies or foreign direct investment into that sector, specifically for companies who are interested in oil and gas exploration and production, right? So also, if you look at some of the changes there, I've mentioned there's a bias for gas. So there's a lot for indigenous participation within that space, if you look at gas. Also, even from the upstream, with IOCs divesting, there's a lot of opportunities out there for indigenous oil and gas companies. So it's essentially looking at indigenizing, there's a word like that, the oil and gas industry, and continue to upscale the capacity of these indigenous oil companies within that space. So that is essentially one of the key opportunities that the Act would present itself with. I mean, also, you would understand that if indigenous oil and gas companies are upscaled and they're doing well, that's naturally a lot of employment opportunities within that space. So for the common man on the street, it's just looking at how you can start to think about harnessing some of those benefits as they come up. Also is looking at the country's ease of doing business. I mean, for the oil and gas industry, it's been an issue over time, given the policy uncertainty, given the lack of transparency within the industry. What the Act seeks to do, if it's implemented in the right direction, right, this is expected to improve ease of doing business within the oil and gas industry. Like I mentioned earlier, there are key improved fiscal terms. Administratively, things are a lot better with two regulators coming on board and bifurcating clearly the responsibilities, either from an upstream angle or a midstream and downstream angle. I mean, it's just a welcome development within that sector, and hopefully, if implemented as it should be, then there should be that opportunity within that sector. Then we look at gas again. Like I said, a bit of bias for gas. There are incentives therein for gas. So if there are companies looking at essentially pipeline, right? There's a lot with respect to incentive, giving an additional 5-year tax holiday. So investors who are ready to build pipelines are given that leeway with respect to having at least an additional 5-year tax holiday. So the initial tax year holiday is already available, which is in accordance with the DTRA, which is 5 years. So having an additional gives you a cumulative of 10 years tax holiday, which is massive. So it's just something for investors within that space to think about. Then for financial markets, we would look at things around certain funds that are required by the Act to be set up. So I mean, I talked through the host community trust fund. Therein, the board of trustees is expected to appoint a fund manager who would manage whatever funds that goes into that, especially the reserve fund, the 20% reserve fund. So it's very good opportunity for fund managers and financial institutions to latch into this. Even environmental remediation funds, midstream gas infrastructure fund, decommissioning and restoration fund. So a couple of funds, right, available for managers to start to think through how you want to assist and help entities or companies involved within that space on how they want to manage, and even the government, how they want to manage some of these funds as the case may be. So very good opportunity in that regard. Then we have potential financial and tax advisory for entities, right, required to segregate activities formerly designated as upstream operations, midstream operations. So not only that, there are financial and tax advisory opportunities for companies who are intending to convert, how you want to advise them to take up the conversion, right? Or whether you want to take up the voluntary conversion or wait for a while, right, before you convert. And also in setting up new entities, what you will be considering, equity requirements, debt requirements, quite a bit, right? And how you can be tax efficient in some of these changes that you've been looking at. So significant opportunities there with individuals and companies operating within that space. Then we have opportunity for lenders, right, who would look at possibly restructuring the loan agreements. Remember that with the change, right, there will be certain financial models being put up by companies to assess the impact of the PIA and how beneficial the PIA will be to them. So, I mean, it's an opportunity for some of the lenders to revalidate whatever future cash flows that you have and see how you can restructure your existing loan agreements, right, and see how that can be of more benefit to you, assuming that you'll be expecting more cash flow, especially given the fact that you have a lot better fiscal incentive or fiscal framework from the Act. And I think key and final would be the NNPC, right? It's very critical. A lot of opportunities are embedded there. The NNPC needs to transfer its assets, interest, liabilities to NNPC Limited. So insurance companies, underwriters have very massive opportunity that they can take up from such angle. Again, for the capital markets, right? The NNPC is setting up the NNPC Limited has a how do I put it? Has a future indication or a future requirement to be listed on the Nigerian Stock Exchange market, right? So, in fact, the GMD of NNPC spoke recently, and they are contemplating that by 2024, right, the NNPC is going to be listed, and you would have its shares being owned by private investors. So, I mean, it's something that you have to start thinking about in that area if you operate within that space, because it's supposed to help improve the Nigerian stock market. Remember, the NNPC Limited is going to be a commercial entity. Listing on the stock exchange will be really great for investors to come in and get some shares within the NNPC Limited. And this is what operates globally, right, with most of the national oil companies. So it's not new. So it's the direction that I'm looking at, and that will definitely also happen. So, I mean, massive opportunities also there embedded therein. So that is much of what I would say for the opportunities. Like I said, it's just to highlight them. There's still a lot, right, that you can also harness from the PIA. On this note, I would say thank you for listening, and available and open to taking questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Familisi. I believe everyone here has a clear understanding of what the PIA, really is about, and of course what is set to achieve. In fact, I had to jot at some point, because there were some things that were, a few things came to me and I just had to note them down. I would, at this point, we would encourage us to use the chat section for questions, so that Mr. Familisi can do justice to that. there's one question there, which I would read out very soon. And of course, I have a couple of questions too from your presentation that I'd like to ask. But let me take the first question in the chat in the chat room. So thank you, Insen Yang, for the question, and let me just read it out. So she says, thank you for the detailed exposure of the Act. How will this Act impact the power sector in terms of generation, distribution, etc.? Because as it stands, the government still controls some parts of the power sector. Mr. Panusi, I would like you to do a bit of justice to that question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Now, the Act is specifically for the oil and gas industry and not necessarily the energy sector. However, as I mentioned in my presentation, one of the key changes that you'll be seeing within the interface between the gas sector and the power sector would be the requirement for a domestic gas delivery obligation. Now, one of the issues that you would have in the power sector is liquidity, as you are well aware, right? Once there's gas being sold to some of these generating companies, what would happen is the gas companies are being owed money for quite a long time, and it goes and cascades down up until where you have the end users, right, with the discos complaining that the tariffs are not cost reflective, which in any case has just recently been changed. So I would say much of the Act does not speak to the power sector, right? It's just focused on the oil and gas sector, and then it tries to mend the interface between the gas sector and the power sector, ensuring that at every point that there's a requirement for gas delivery to power plants, right? That must be done. If it is not done, there's a penalty that is attached to producers who fail to comply with the minimum domestic obligation requirements, which will be applied by the authority through the commission on the producers. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, so I take this as if the Act does, as it says, that of no account should that once there's a need for gas in the power sector, I mean, it sort of has given the power sector some form of let's say leverage or advantage to say that at any time when they need gas, they should have, and there's also a penalty. So we're hoping and believing that this would help with improving power generation and distribution in the country. Thank you. There's another question from Abdullahi Shoaibu. Thank you very much. And he says here that it's been a wonderful lecture, and says, can you explain more on the tax holiday for gas operators?
Okay, so I mentioned earlier, so generally within the IDITRA, right, and the pioneer status list and approved industry, companies involved in gas utilization, right, they can be awarded a pioneer status. That's a tax holiday of at least 3 years, right, which can be extended for another 2 years. So cumulatively looking at a possible 5-year tax holiday, right, for those entities. There is also that similar requirement within the Companies Income Tax Act, right, which also provides that tax holiday, that's section 39 to be precise, right? It's called the gas utilization incentive, right, which also you can take advantage of, right? It's also a tax holiday, or if you don't take the tax holiday, there is an additional investment allowance, right? And also an accelerated capital allowance that you can take in that regard. So that is specifically for gas utilization companies. Now, what the PIA introduced is an additional 5-year tax holiday for entities that are involved in building gas pipelines. So it's specific on gas pipeline, so not generally just gas utilization. So if you are going to be involved in building gas pipelines, there's an additional tax incentive that you can enjoy in that space, which is then taking your cumulative to at least 10 years tax holiday.
Wow. Wow, that's pretty much impressive. Hopefully this, I mean, all this comes to fruition. Okay, thank you very much. There's another question from Chinasa. I'll read that right away. From the downstream perspective, he or she says the setup of NNPC Limited and the company generating its own revenue. Do you see conflict of interest, seeing as the company is still government owned compared to privately owned downstream oil companies?
NNPC Limited is no longer going to be government owned. Yes, the shares are going to be held by Ministry of Finance Incorporated and Ministry of Petroleum Resources Incorporated, but the requirement is it has no recourse to government funds anymore. It will have no recourse. It needs to look inwards and start to make its own money. So it needs to be sufficiently capitalized, right? And those are the thought process. I think recently, the GMD also did mention that if there are any activity with any of the subsidiaries, any activity with any of the producer, any activity with the government. So for instance, if you are remitting funds to the government, right, that activity going forward will be subject to a charge. So it needs to start designing how it needs to make its own money. Right, so from that angle, it's not essentially going to be a government-owned enterprise. The shares are still just supposed to be held by the Ministry of Petroleum Resources Incorporated and Finance Incorporated. Ultimately, the aim is to privatize NNPC, and that is already in the works. And hopefully, 2024, we'll probably be having the first initial public offering for the shares of NNPC Limited. So I would say there won't be any conflict of interest as we speak, right? It's to ensure that whatever would be done in transiting from NNPC to NNPC Limited is void of any disruption to the current commercial arrangements that we have within the sector, which is what is very, very, very key, right? Because we are transiting, we cannot stop commercial activities within that sector. Employees cannot be employees cannot be unhappy, right? Such that some of the unions that we have, the unions who are very strong, then start to stop commercial activities within that space. So that's just the thing that needs to be put in place as we speak. But no, there's no conflict. There shouldn't be any conflict.
Okay, thank you. Just to add to what you've also said, and Chinasa, I hope you're listening. Just yesterday, CAC said that they've completed the process of the NNPC Limited. So that's to probably give a direction to the PIA being fully effective in making, of course, in privatizing the NNPC. So I'm sure that very, very soon we'll probably hear more of that in the news as the days go by. So there's another question from Tim Chang. Thank you, Tim Chang. And he's asking, what are your thoughts about the federal government's recent move to amend the PIA? He says, I understand there are several concerns around the act, but do you think the suddenness of the amendment could adversely impact investor confidence in the space?
Okay, my thoughts. I would say.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so I would say that now the section, let me first start with the sections that were amended. Section 11, subsection 2, and section 11, subsection 3, section 34, subsection 2, so 34, subsection 3 were amended. And the amendment is to the governing council of the commission and the governing council of the authority. Now, the amendment seeks to increase the board within the governing council for the commission from 9 to 13. And the explanation was they need the board to cut across all 6 geopolitical regions, which I would think is okay, if you ask me, just to ensure that there's participation by every 6 geopolitical region. Same goes for what the administration will be doing, right? So then the other amendment, or under subsection 3, is to seek to reduce the powers of the Senate in approving recommendations by the president as to members of the governing council, right, of the commission and the authority. So I think there are three key areas where the president does not want the Senate to sit through and have them being interviewed and all of that, because of, I would say, that there is a need to quickly set up the commission and the authority. There cannot be any further delay in the setup of the commission and the authority. As you've heard, the NNPC Limited, CAC concluded NNPC Limited yesterday. And that was because last week, the president gave a marching order that must be done immediately. So it's the same thought process. I wouldn't say it should affect investor confidence, because what they're trying to do is to ensure that the implementation of the PIA is pushed and done as quickly as possible. Because whether you like it or not, there are certain benefits that are available to parties if you significantly look at what you have with your current portfolio of operations, right? There are benefits that are embedded there, and it's the thought process is, how do you take those benefits if you do not have the commission and you do not have the authority set up? So this needs to be done as quickly as possible. And that's the recommendation that was passed by the president. I do not think that should affect investor confidence in any way, right? Because most of what the investor confidence will be coming from is to ensure that there's still transparency, that there's a lot more improved transparency within the governance and the administrative framework, and there is within the host community and the fiscal framework, some of the benefits there are not taken away. So I would say my answer to that would be I do not think so, but we are still watching the space, and I'll see how that pans out.
Okay. Well, maybe a few more thoughts to that. Okay. While I also probably agree that it shouldn't distort investor confidence, but I also think that even though the president is trying to fulfill the federal character issue here, that the board of the NNPC Limited should come from the 6 geopolitical zones. But of course, in terms of integrity, I think that's where, or that's why the Senate probably does the interviewing of all candidates. Albeit we want it to be quick. I mean, even though he said, oh, it was done ASAP, but I just think, I mean, it will be nice or fair for, of course, the entire citizenry to know, okay, who and who have been appointed and what are their and things like. But I mean, like you said, we hope that this doesn't adversely impair investor confidence. So we have a few more questions. There's also one from Adesha Adioye. Thank you very much for your question. And she's asking that, look at, she says, thank you, Mr. Pamilusi, for the fantastic presentation. Looking at the objectives of the PIA and all tax incentives, she says, I don't see how the objectives will be achieved. What are your thoughts?
Sorry, could you take that? Could you take that again, please?
Okay, she says, thank you, Mr. Pamilusi, for the fantastic presentation. She's looking at the objectives of the PIA and the tax incentives. I don't see how the objectives will be achieved. What are your thoughts? She's asking for your thoughts as to how the objectives of the PIA will be achieved vis-a-vis the tax incentives given by the PIA. Your thoughts on that, please?
Well, I would say it's not new for us to have an overhaul in our tax laws and tax landscape, as the case may be. If you are aware, year on year now, starting from 2019, we now have Finance Act, which seeks to look at our current laws and see how they are reflective of the current climate. The truth is that our fiscal provisions, right, which essentially touches on the taxes, have not been competitive, which has been one of the reasons why we've had investment flight, right, in Nigeria within that space. So going to other African countries, I would say it is very achievable, right, if the right implementation process is is being put in place, which I understand, which we know is currently being worked through. It's not going to be an easy process, but the team is actively working. Sometime early this month, we were at the, we've actually made certain presentations to the presidential committee that was inaugurated for implementing the PIA. So I'll tell you that a lot of work is going on behind the scenes that we do not know. I would say the objective is very achievable, right? If the implementation is put into place, you would notice that even with respect to the PIA, a lot of investors outside of the country are already beginning to ask questions, right? See how there are possible investments for them within this space, given the fiscal changes are now are now favorable and very competitive. However, the case here would be what exactly are we thinking through when it comes to energy transition? That is where the bone of contention is, because if you look at the global economy, we are already moving away from oil and gas, right? Going into renewables. And if you look at the PIA, this was not addressed by the PIA. But what I would say is, given that the world is moving towards, I mean, with the Paris climate, which we are even a part of, right? We need to quickly monetize whatever it is that we have with respect to our reserves, right? Earn money and then start to push that money into renewables. Because whether you like it or not, a lot of commitments are already out there. I mean, if you look at the EU, by 2030, EU has promised that it will cut fossil fuels, right, by at least 50%. So everybody's thinking renewables already. The UK talked about 30%. Even Nigeria, as part of the Paris climate, has put forward a 20% cut by 2045. So a lot still needs to happen within monetizing what we have and then pushing that into renewables, which is what the PIA has not considered, right? And which is what is still key for the government to still think through. But part of the objectives, I would say very achievable. It's not the first time we're having a change in tax laws and a change in tax landscape, and then we've been able to implement that successfully.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have just two more questions, and we'll probably about 12 minutes to round up this session. There's another question here from Yomari, and she's asking, she said, putting into consideration the risk and the health of the people living around the refineries in Delta and Port Harcourt, I guess, of course, the Delta and Port Harcourt, how can gas flaring be stopped? Are there penalties? And of course, would they hold water? Will anyone be prosecuted?
Okay, for prosecution, I do not know about that, right? But there are significant penalties. Before now, gas flare penalties were at 0.025 million metric British thermal units. That's for dollars. So that it has increased to 2.5. So that's a massive increase. And as $2.5 sounds, is a lot. And what it seeks to do is to force producers to start thinking of a gas development plan. Like I said, if you look at the administrative part of the act, there's a lot of bias and focus on gas development. So the gas penalties are real. Companies are starting to think through it and see how that can be managed, and they are starting to think through gas development plans. Remember that part of what we also signed up on the Paris Climate Accord is to significantly reduce our carbon footprint. And if we must do that, we can't be flaring gas, right? So that has to substantially reduce. And a lot of companies are having to sit at a round table to assess their gas development plan, especially for the domestic market, which is what the government is actually really focused on. So I can assure you the penalties are real, right? I do not know about conviction, right? That's to the members of the company or as the case may be. But I know that the penalties are real and they are significantly high. Again, those penalties, you cannot even take any tax deduction. So if you flare and you pay those penalties, not only would you pay, so your cash flow will be impacted twice. You would pay that penalty, and not only would you pay the penalty, you cannot tax deduct or cost recover. So it means your taxes will then go up by virtue of the fact that you are even flaring. So double whammy for you. So the right thing for you is to start to think of how you want to monetize whatever associated gas you have within your fields instead of flaring them.
Okay, seems fair, even though we probably can't really talk much on prosecution, but maybe we can probably take this question concerning the host community. So we know that there's a Niger Delta Development Company on one hand, and we know that the PIA is also saying that that there will be trust fund for host communities. So is there a convergence within the NDDC and the host community trust fund in the PIA? Or is the PIA saying that NDDC would cease to exist because and the trust fund will then take the place of the NDDC? I mean, what's the correlation with, in the PIA between the NDDC and the host community trust funds?
Unfortunately, the answer to that question is no. So the NDDC will still remain. That's the Niger Delta Development Commission, which essentially is at 3% of your budgeted operating expenditure. And you would also have your trust fund, which you would contribute 3% also of your preceding year annual operating expenditure. So those are kind of the uncertainties, or let's say the question marks being put forward to the implementation team, because the question is, what then is the requirement to have the NDDC, right, and also the requirement to have the development trust fund from the host community. So I mean, those are things that they still need to have a second look as to how that will then impact costs for companies operating within this area. So I mean, it's a whole lot. If you look at 3%, sometimes they run into millions of dollars, right? So no one wants to be coughing out millions of dollars excessively that do not necessarily make so much sense to them. So, I mean, there's a potential cost increase in that area. It's just what I would say with respect to that.
Okay. Our last question, I'll just probably read through in time because we have about 2 minutes to go. Thank you, Mr. Oluwaseun Adebigbia. And he's asking, do you think DPR has the capacity to ensure compliance?
So if the DPR doesn't have capacity to upscale, and I would say that the DPR has capacity. Now, the only thing that is going to happen with DPR is simple. DPR has, how would I put it, has a road that cuts across every value chain. So the simple thing is to break it up, set up the commission and the authority, and activities relating to the upstream. Remember, these activities are not going to significantly change. They are still the same activities that are being carried out, but you just need to put those activities in a bucket for better administration and also transparency within that particular space or that particular value chain that you're operating. So I would say the DPR has capacity, right? Remember, they are going to be the most significant regulator who will be splitting into two. So whatever it is that they are doing currently is same as what the commission and the authority would be doing. It's just that they would need to have certain subsidiary regulations to harness and improve efficiency within that industry. So I would say my simple response is they should have the capacity. And another thing you should notice, part of what is being done by the implementation team is to also look at an assessment. So there's an assessment going on as to what level of activity should move to upstream, what level of activity should move to midstream and downstream, and also look at the skills of people operating within the DPR in cases where you will probably have a cross function across the streams, and look at where your skills better fit and put you into the right bucket. So like I said, a lot still happening in the industry. I think they are capable of compliance. They are the ones that have been running the compliance up to date. But there's a need to improve transparency and efficiency in the industry. And so there needs to be that spirit, which the PIA has already contemplated.
Okay, I hope that answers Mr. Adeoye's question. However, we have a few in-house questions. I'll just quickly run through them. So first, we had a couple of dates in terms of the PIA. I mean, we've had some dates of when it was presented by the Senate and the likes. So, I mean, at this point, I would like to ask, when exactly does the PIA become effective? What date exactly does it become effective, barring all the dates it was signed and all the likes?
Okay, so the PIA was signed 16th of August, 2021. It was gazetted 27th of August, 2021, and the gazette date is your effective date. So from 27th of August to February 2023, like I mentioned, you would have the opportunity to assess your portfolio of assets and determine whether you want to convert to the PIA terms or not. So again, effective date will be from the 27th of August, 2021.
Okay. So I recall Tim Chang talked about some amendments in the PIA. Even as of this morning, I still read that the host communities are still pushing for 5% as against the 3% that was in the PIA. So I was wondering, so now all these amendments, does it affect the takeoff of the act? All the amendments here and there coming. Of course, you mentioned that there are still certain gray areas that will need to be ironed out within the act. But how does it affect the takeoff of the act in any way?
I don't think so. It shouldn't. It does not, because the act has taken off. That's the reality. The act has commenced since 27th of August. Irrespective of amendments that we have, right? The act is still the act. Has been signed to law. It's been gazetted. If there are amendments, subsidiary regulations and operational guidelines may be issued by the Commission and the authority. One thing I would say, and I've mentioned earlier, is one critical bit of the act itself, having things started to having things being put into place and in shape, is to have the Commission and the authority set up, and which is what the implementation committee is actively working on. They're trying to do that to also ensure that they avoid disruptions within the industry as we speak. So commercial operations, they want it to continue as it is, but the Commission and the authority needs to be set up ASAP, because some of the requirements for conversion is going to be administered by the Commission and the authority, and so they need to be set up and running such that some of these things can start up as quickly as possible.
Okay. That probably helps. Okay, so I also recall that during your presentation you talked about a lot of countries moving to renewable energy. I mean, you mentioned the EU and the likes. But here, Dangote Refinery is supposed to come on stream, I think sometime next year or thereabouts. So Dangote Refinery and the PIA, I mean, how then will Dangote Refinery fare? I know you also talked about the PIA trying to push for more indigenization of the oil and gas sector. So how does Dangote Refinery then fare? I mean, within the PIA.
So the Dangote Refinery, not only Dangote Refinery, I would say we also have other local refiners like Walter Smith's Petrochemical, a couple of other refiners as well. So I would say that therefore within the midstream downstream bracket, right, with respect to refining petroleum products. And other than the fact that we have required regulations and regulations that guide refineries, right, nothing significant should happen to them. Now, before before the president signed the act, there was there was an uproar within the downstream sector with respect to the refiners. And I would say that section 317, subsection 8, was contemplating the import of crude oil products to be assigned to only local refiners, which was supposed to massively benefit people like Dangote once they come on stream and on board, right? But by the time the president signed it, that was changed, right? So because there was an uproar by the local marketing companies who are also involved in the importation of crude products, because doing that would mean that they would then no longer have any business. So the Act, I think in subsection 8, said they could backward integrate. So the authority could determine and backward integrate local refiners with marketing companies, right? And then subsection 9 saying the local refiners are the ones with the exclusive right for the importation of crude oil products when there's a shortage. So that was changed. So the president in signing also included the capacity for people who already have the proven expertise, right, in recruiting crude, in importing crude oil products. So did not essentially leave out the downstream or marketers who operate within the industry. So I won't say not much would be changing for them, and maybe the crude oil obligation, right? There's a section in the PIA that also speaks to producers being required to ensure that at every point there's some level of crude oil being handed over to the refiners based on contractual arrangements between both parties. So not much I would say from that angle, other than the fact that what they were expecting would be an exclusive right was changed when the PIA was signed.
Okay, so I hear, I still hear imports of crude oil in case of shortage, and I was quite surprised to see, that the Act will still provide that they import, and I'm looking at it from this angle that we are trying to commercialize an NPC, because when you commercialize, we may probably not have the petroleum pricing company, on board anymore. And then, so if we're importing, the pricing, is it going to be free fall? Are we still going to fix prices? I don't know. It seems like a bit of mumbo jumble. And like you said, we hope that some of these reforms that are coming now will probably address some of these areas. And I would like to say thank you very much, Mr. Familusi. I have learned a lot. I've gained a lot. And from the comments in the chat, everyone is quite impressed with how you broke down the PIE. I think for me so far so good. This is the best I've seen it simplified. It's clear. There's a comment here from Ibrahim Boyi, says great engagement, clarifying a lot of haziness of the PIE. I want to say thank you so much for honoring this call. I think we would have a word now from my MD just before we close. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Familusi and the attendees. Thank you so much for breaking it down, making it, it's a lot of, we know it's a very technical topic, but you succeeded in making all of, myself understand it a bit more, and hopefully the general public have a better understanding of it. It's unfortunate the way we do things in Nigeria. The PIB, the Petroleum Industry Bill, I remember was first presented in 2008. So you would think that for a bill that has been with the National Assembly for about 13 years, all turning issues would have been considered before it was passed. And so I aligned with Tim Chang, I think, who raised concern about a bill that was just passed in July being amended already 3 months down the line, But again, maybe the positive angle to that is that we have a government that is listening and is just reacting to the public opinion on it, and that's why it's quick to amend it. But hopefully, we're in a better place from where we were before the act, and hopefully the amendment would also make it a better operating environment, because Nigeria, of course, is likely dependent on that industry, the petroleum industry. Again, Mr. Family, say, I know that you're avoiding anything political, and I respect that, being a professional. And but the learning point for me for subsequent discussions is that when it has to do with policies or things that may have a tint of political undertone, perhaps we would want to bring someone in to give government perspective on it, because questions around the controversial states VAT law and PIA, one would want to know what impact and all of that. I'm not asking you because I know you would not want to give your opinion because of the firm that you represent, and of course subsidy and all of that. So I just want to thank you again and our audience for the time. Someone asked a question about the slides. Yes, we'll be happy to share the slides, and I think the presentation itself to all of us. If you do not, if you're able to enter this discussion without registering it before now, please drop your email on the chat box. But you can also send us email at feedback@uticacap.com. feedback@uticacap.com. We can take your feedback on this or any other topic you think that we should be speaking about in Utica Discuss. This is going to be a periodic platform where we discuss topical issues. We're not giving time frame to the frequency of it, so it may not be a monthly discourse, but we try to at least have one within a quarter. And as issues come up, we try to bring it because it's part of our responsibility to the larger community and our clients in particular. I'm sure I would not have done my job today if I do not encourage you all to please do business with Utica. We're here to serve you. We're licensed as a fund and portfolio management company. We deal with, we manage investment for both the retail, the mass affluent, and the ultra high net worth, both individual, institution, corporate bodies. And of course, somebody asked a question about the PIA opportunity. It would be nice if Utica is appointed as fund manager to the community trust fund, bring our expertise to, and also contribute to our own quota to the development of those community, apart from, and also help them grow and give them good returns on their funds. So again, thank you everyone. I look forward to seeing you at the next discourse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you so much. Thank you everyone for honoring our invitation, for sparing time to listen to us. We're very grateful. Just like you said, please drop your email addresses in the chat box so we can collate and then forward the slides as already stated earlier. Once again, we are very grateful. We thank you, and we hope that that at the next session that you will also be kind enough to also honor our invitation. Thank you so much. And on this note, we like to close the session and also wish everyone here a happy Independence tomorrow. Thank you very much. Bye-bye and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Dr. Lucy. Thumbs up. Thanks.